Today I'm going to talk about firmware security. How does firmware security work? How are devices made secure against an attack? Well, in many cases they aren't, and no doubt you've seen some examples of this in the news. But let's ignore that for now and assume that the device has a functioning security mechanism. How does it work? At the very basic level, the manufacturer of the device aims to ensure that only authorized firmware runs on the device. Now, ideally the firmware is built and verified entirely by the vendor, and this is called verified boot. But firmware consists of very many pieces, as I mentioned with the AP firmware talk. Each piece is loaded one after the other as the boot moves through the various phases. An attacker just needs to replace one of those pieces and he can gain control of that firmware phase and everything from then on. The first phase is critical since it is the first thing loaded. How does the device ensure that it is valid? There are two main mechanisms used. The first is to use a public-private key pair. Each SoC shipped has a public key embedded in it. The device vendor, or maybe the SoC vendor, signs the first phase with the private key. When starting up, the SoC loads the first phase, checks it against the public key, and refuses to continue if there is a mismatch. Now this ensures that only signed firmware can be booted. A second mechanism is to put the first phase into read-only flash, so that once the device is manufactured, it cannot be changed. This ensures that only the original firmware can be booted. Now, in either case, a chain of trust is created where each phase checks the next one to see if it is valid. If so, the next phase is executed and things move on. If not, then the device cannot boot. It may have a recovery mechanism to reload valid firmware, or it may just give up and brick itself, so it has to be returned for repair. The last firmware phase typically loads the operating system and, for Linux at least, selects the root disk to use. Both of these can also be signed, just like the firmware, but we'll leave those details for another time. So if this technique is used, does that mean firmware is always secure? Not necessarily. If the private key is somehow leaked, either by accident or maliciously, all the devices using that key lose their protection. If there is a flaw in any of the phases, such as a buffer overflow bug, then an attacker may be able to get in. We should note that the SoC vendor may require some pieces of closed source private firmware, which cannot be reviewed by the vendor or anyone else. Intel and AMD both do this, for example. But in general, the approach I've described can provide a good level of security.